I love cycling. I love books, and I really, really love cycling books. If there was a podcast that I wished someone else would create for me personally, just so that I could listen to it, it would be this one, chatting to authors about cycling and about their books. Even though I have this obsession with cycling books and magazines, it was in early 2023 when I realised I hadn't actually read a cycling book from start to finish for years, several years. Why was this? Well, I think it was partly because they weren't being written with anything like the frequency we'd seen 10 or 15 years ago when the Team Sky boom had really gripped cycling publishing in the English language. But I also think it was because I had spent those years working full-time at GCN. I had allowed that job to wash over me completely and take over my life, really. Subconsciously, at least I think it was subconsciously in hindsight, I didn't turn to books to fill my head with cycling while lying in bed at night anymore. I had this full-time job to do that for me. But in the summer of 2023, a book came along which snapped me out of it, mainly because of the subject matter, Jan Ullrich. He was a major figure during my formative years as a cycling fan, the time when you're a young teenager and everything means more. Races, faces and names embed themselves in your brain and never leave. I can remember more about the 1997 Tour de France that Ullrich won than I can about last year's Tour de France. But it was also about the identity of the author, whose writing in Pro Cycling magazine I had always deeply admired. Anyone who listens to Daniel Friebe on the Cycling Podcast will know that this book took longer to write than he intended. He started the process in 2015. Usually, publishers want a cycling book written and done within a year. If the process is approaching 2 years, something's gone terribly wrong. Daniel finished his book 8 years after he started it. I spoke to Daniel recently about why that was and all about his book, Jan Ullrich, The Best There Never Was. Well, I've spent so long trying and failing to get him to invite me onto his podcast that I have given up and been forced to create my own podcast and invite him onto here just to get him to talk to me. Welcome, author of Jan Ullrich, The Best There Never Was, Mr. Daniel Friebe.
Welcome. It's broadly accurate.
Right, I'll start here. I interviewed Matt Rendell once, years ago, about his book, The Death of Marco Pantani. And he said, jokingly, that it really should have been called The Death of Matt Rendell by Marco Pantani. And I wonder, is the same true of this book? Should it have been called The Death of Daniel Friebe by Jan Ullrich?
You know, it is a book about a famous cyclist and not about me. And the subject matter itself doesn't have that much. It does have something to do with why it was so arduous for me. And in a similar way to Matt Rendell's book, I think maybe more so for his book that, you know, obviously he was dealing with a death and he was also dealing with things in the life of Marco Pantani that were contentious and had to be sort of relitigated almost literally. And I think that in itself was very traumatic. There were things in the Jan Ullrich story that were very difficult. And it almost, you know, we were close to talking about, I don't want to say a literal death there, but we were kind of dealing with the death of a person. Jan Ullrich, his life had fallen apart. So there were things there that were difficult to negotiate. But in my case, the difficulties that I had were an awful lot to do with me and my kind of relationship with sort of writing and the project. And then there was, particularly in the last few years, from sort of 2018 to 2022, when I finally brought the book out, there were a lot of very complicated sort of needles that I had to thread in terms of getting people to help me complete the story.
And like, while writing it, Ullrich kind of emerged because he was kind of missing when you started. And by the time it came to finishing it up and releasing it, he was kind of back in the public consciousness. I mean, what was the kind of timeline like for you trying to get it finished? But now all of a sudden there are new chapters unfolding in front of you. And how did you or could you conceive of drawing a line with the book?
So, you know, I wrote the proposal in 2014 The first interview I did was Lance Armstrong in March 2015, but I think it was going to come out, it was either 2016 or 2017. Because of me, again, difficulties that I was having in getting it finished and feeling as though I was satisfied with it. It was dragging, so it got put back a year, then another year. And then 2018 happened. 2018 was this awful summer where, or he had been kind of out of the public eye to a large extent for a few years, but not completely. And it was fairly well known that he was having various difficulties linked to maybe alcohol, maybe other issues. But then in 2018, it all came crashing down. And to the extent that, I alluded earlier to the fact that his life was in jeopardy, really. His life was in danger. That's what you could feel from afar, but that was the reality, which I later found out was later brought home to me quite graphically. At that point, I was pretty close to finishing it, but then I had a bit of a moral dilemma. Just approaching the subject. I spent a lot of time thinking about the impact that it could have if the book was published, and how the book was going to be marketed and distributed. And I'd had this experience. I'd had enough experience by that point that I you can foresee certain things. Okay. And I'd had an experience within the book I wrote about Eddie Merckx where I sort of fed a headline to a Belgian colleague just before the book came out about Eddie Merckx having this heart problem, which was kind of known, but it wasn't known. Well, I sort of unearthed new details about it. And the top line was that Eddie Merckx shouldn't have been a cyclist. He should have, he could have killed himself by riding a bike. Anyway, this was obviously newsworthy. I'd sort of fed it to a Belgian colleague before that book came out. And then the next day, Eddie Merckx is across the Belgian press saying, I don't know this author, I don't know this guy, and I'm going to sue him. And I was just sort of curled up in a ball in my living room in the dark for the next 4 days, because this was just my worst nightmare. I just didn't have the sort of constitution for this. So, and that was kind of an example. It was probably a bad example because in a way, I'd sort of orchestrated my own nightmare there. But fast forward 10 years or whatever, or nearly 10 years, I knew how these things could go. And I knew how Ullrich had been covered in the German press. And I knew there was a certain, I use the German word, Schadenfreude on the part of the German media. They'd sort of, they'd almost watched him self-immolate with kind of glee. So I knew there was a danger of that. Even if a book came out in the UK, even if it wasn't translated, whatever, I knew that I could contribute to a situation that was unfolding. So that was a problem. And then even had I decided to just press on, obviously at that point, everyone became very nervous around the subject. It was already difficult, really difficult to talk to a lot of people about, even prior to 2018, because Ullrich had never made any enemies. And I talk about this in the book. And this was one key difference between him and Armstrong. He didn't make any enemies, and everyone was terrified because they had such affection for him. They were terrified of saying anything, doing anything which would displease him or which would compound his problems. So there was already this whole kind of this nervousness around the subject. Some of it is also a very German attitude towards privacy as well. Germany was the first country in the world to have like a data protection law. The Germans are, for good reason, the Germans are very they're very sort of nervous around issues to do with privacy. So then, in 2018, with this all going on, it almost became impossible to get to what was actually going on and to complete the story, which anyway, at that point, I didn't feel it was appropriate to complete the story. You say that he was kind of emerging at the end. He wasn't really. I mean, since 2008, after 2018, there was almost no news for 2-3 years. And some of the news was relapses. So when I did the last interview and I went to kind of find him, or I went to get as close as possible to in the Black Forest, he just had, he was sort of 4 months down the line from his latest relapse, which proved to be, fingers crossed, his last one. And it was all, and then the big question was, it's 2022, it's 25 years since he won, 25 years since he won the tour. He's going to get asked about it. Is he going to be able to emerge into the light? And is he going to, is he going to be able to give interviews? How's German TV going to treat him? So he was still sort of very much kind of under wraps in March 2022 when I finished it.
I was always kind of curious just how the publishers, well, your relationship with the publisher throughout the process, and how nervous they were about doping and details. Because at that time, I think I'm right in saying, well, Ullrich never tested positive or anything, same as a lot of people who doped. But he also hadn't really confessed to anything. I think he kind of sort of acknowledged it, but hadn't really confessed to anything until 2023. So like, what your entire time writing it, like, was there any kind of pressure to go, whoa, we can't actually say that? Or was it just like, look, this is kind of an all open secret at this stage. The legalities of writing about doping don't really apply here.
He'd never been litigious, unlike Armstrong. Never. Which is not to say that I wasn't nervous of that, because I was nervous of it. But I think he certainly, 2017, 18, the nervousness around that was sort of dissipating a little bit, and the focus kind of moved on to, okay, what can we say about the fact that he's, using cocaine and is a drug addict, recreational drug addict. But, there were things, for example, I talk about it in the book. He had confessed in 2007 in an interview with a very well-known German journalist, and that interview had never run. He'd got cold feet at the last moment. Someone leaked a transcript of that interview to me, so I had the whole confession, and it wasn't maybe as exhaustive as some of what Armstrong said about his doping and whatever. And it was laid out. It was laid out very clearly. But of course, that was one. There the publisher did draw the line, and to be honest, I didn't really fight that. I couldn't, I couldn't use quotes from that interview, for example, that had never been published. But there was a huge welter of evidence, and there was a huge history. There was 10 years at that point of the German media in particular having taken it as an accepted fact and written openly about the fact that he had dope.
The section of the book that deals with Operation Puerto in 2006 and the end of Jan Ullrich's cycling career is, I found it really compelling. I mean, it reads like a thriller in some places.
Enough blood to run a medium-sized hematology unit and keep Dan Brown in conspiracy theories for a 6-book deal. But the blood in these bags, nearly 100 of them, was seized by Spain's Guardia Civil from Eufemiano Fuentes, a Madrid doctor with a long list of cycling clients and a code system a 7-year-old could crack. The raid, part of a long-running Spanish investigation called Operation Puerto, also found transfusion equipment and a flying pharmacy of performance-enhancing drugs. That was in May. Since then, the rumour mill has been on double shifts. Nearly 60 cyclists were said to be implicated, including some of the biggest names in the sport. On Thursday, the biggest names in the sport turned up for their pre-tour medicals, apparently without a care in the world. Germany's Jan Ullrich and Ivan Basso of Italy, outwardly concerned only with which of them would succeed Lance Armstrong. But by yesterday morning, the rumours had solidified into a 500-page report outlining the criminal case in Spain. First to go, under pressure from his sponsor T-Mobile, was the 1997 Tour winner Ullrich.
I know you're not supposed to say this or probably even think of it, but like, is there any part of you as a journalist misses those days where you're chasing the story and a big doping scandal has happened? Because it's been a long time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, to be blunt, yeah. I mean, I've talked about this quite a lot before, particularly, there were 3 years, 2006 to 2008, when it was a real white knuckle ride. And well, the Tours de France of those years 6, 7, 8 were wild, and particularly that first weekend in 2006 in Strasbourg. I don't think anyone who's there will forget that. And it was thrilling. It really was. I mean, I can go into more detail about why it was thrilling, but I'm sure you can imagine why it was thrilling. That the eve of that Tour de France, I remember the first image I have from Strasbourg I was on the steps of the Palais des Congrès where the press conferences were going to happen. And I saw my friend from the La Gazzetta dello Sport, Luigi Perna, and we had a conversation about Basso's dog, who we'd both met at Basso's house years earlier, and we both remembered the name, and this corresponded with a code name for Basso in the Fuentes files. And then Patrice Clerc, the chief exec of ASO, bowls in with Christian Prudhomme, who was only in his sort of second Tour de France in the management then, but so wasn't as well known. And then it was just pandemonium. The whole day was pandemonium, and being sort of wedged into the entrance of a Holiday Inn with Bjarne Riis giving this sort of impromptu press conference. And this kind of thing happened quite a lot back then. And I haven't really seen anything like it, certainly in the last 10 years. The huge bundle, 5 deep. We're all sort of craning with our recorders. Meanwhile, Ivan Basso is sort of sneaking out the back door, and we kind of see the car go past. He's behind the tinted windows. And I'm not going to say we'd seen so much, experienced so much of this that it was kind of normalized, but we did almost become matter of fact about it. Certainly by 2007, 2008, something like this was happening every day. And those 3 tours were a real concentration of all of that. But actually the Giro for the 3 or 4 years before that had been a bit of I'd been in the Giro, and they'd given us a bit of a foretaste of this. There'd been quite a lot of that sort of stuff at the Giro. So it was all quite familiar by that point. The stakes were just a bit higher.
Like, it's such a bygone era now. Like, there's a whole generation of cycling fans who just haven't experienced a doping scandal. Like, a pop quiz for you. Do you remember who the last person was to test positive at the Tour de France?
In the Tour de France?
Yeah.
To be riding the Tour de France and to be ejected from the Tour de France?
Yeah.
Oh. Frank Schleck?
Yeah, I'll give you that. It's sort of Frank Schleck in 2012. Luca Paolini got popped for cocaine in 2015, which I don't know. It feels like it doesn't really count. But yeah, for performance-enhancing drug, Frank Schleck in 2012. Very good. Yeah, but Jesus, like it's 12 and a half years ago now. Yeah. But I kind of started at the end there. But let me take you back then to the beginning and ask you, what is your first memory of Jan? Maybe not your first memory of Jan Ullrich, but the first impactful one.
Ullrich certainly cannot respond to any of these attacks. In fact, the attack originated at the bottom of the climb by Richard Virenque, currently in second position. But then all of a sudden, the man with the white jersey of the champion of Germany just accelerated and went away on his own. And now the last man in front of him, Jean-Philippe Daujois, and very soon I think he too will be history.
Well, he took the race to the rest, but I'm afraid he's paid the price. He took a good look across at Jan Ullrich, and if he took a good look at his face, he can see this man is not under pressure at all. Ullrich has waited as much as he could. Yesterday, he was definitely under the command of Bjarne Riis. Today, I guess he's realised that Riis hasn't quite got the legs of 1996. This young man could be racing to the yellow jersey now, and he's got to defend that for an awful long time if he wants to win the Tour de France.
Well, these 2 riders are supposed to be climbers. They must be able to do something against the onslaught of Jan Ullrich. The time gap at the moment, 25 seconds to these 2 riders. And in fact, Bjarne Riis is 45 seconds down on his own teammate, Jan Ullrich.
Well, here is a chance to have a look
Talk
at
about it, I
Bjarne
think, in
Riis.
the
I wonder
preface
what
of the
he's
book.
thinking.
Really, I suppose, the germ of the idea to write this book it's an image. And I think we all have these images where we've been cycling fans at any point, which are just a sort of concentration of emotion. And in this, I mean, I was very insistent about this being the image, the cover image for the book. It was Ullrich in the German champions jersey winning Arcalis in Andorra in 1997. I talk about it in the book. I was on holiday in Italy and I was watching it with my dad, who was not interested in cycling. And that was really the first Tour de France that I'd watched everywhere. I'd watched sort of every stage where I was really kind of hooked. And the whole moment just seemed monumental. And, I knew this already, but it was quite reassuring, sort of heartening, I suppose, to go back and talk to a lot of people, even people who at that stage were kind of long in the tooth in 1997, who had already, they weren't like me at their first sort of rodeo, who also felt that it was kind of monumental. Even in the last 5 years with Pogacar, I don't think there's been a moment that has carried as much, as much heft as that moment, in terms of, it wasn't Ulrich. We weren't discovering who Ulrich was that day. He'd already finished on the podium the year before in the Tour, and then, by some people's estimates, he was already the favourite for 97. And the time gap is big, but it's not 6 minutes either. However, there was just something about it which made everyone in unison just go, wow. And I've talked about this quite a lot as well, that it was perfect scandal and same attitude toward those displays, some almost outrageous displays of physical dominance. It was a reaction of awe rather than a sort of knowing, cynical, eyebrow raised sort of reaction. So
I was trying to think back to my own memories of 1997 when I saw this, and I'm much younger than you, of course, and so it's harder for me. During the 90s, like, I remember watching the Tour de France in the summer, but my experience of cycling was really, as I'm sure it was for a lot of kids, experienced kind of vicariously through my own dad, and he was the big cycle fan, and I was just kind of being carried along.
Yeah.
And yet, I remember, not in 97, but in the years that followed, pre-internet, that a big topic of conversation was Jan Ullrich's weight during the winter. Already, it must have been, I don't know, it must have just been through Cycling Weekly or Cyclosport or however my dad was getting his information.
In which year?
This would have been 99 maybe.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. 100%. Yeah.
And I have memories of this. I found that unusual that I was receiving this kind of second hand, that it was such a big topic that I was aware of this in the winter. And so that's a roundabout way of getting to the question of his weight is obviously a massive topic of conversation when it comes to his life and career. Did you find that extremely difficult to write about? Because it's not a straightforward topic to address, and I don't know. I think you did deal with it with great sensitivity, but did you find that hard?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's a great temptation. To be honest, I was told some great stories about it, and there's some great, some funny lines about it, and I don't know whether some of them were a bit close to the bone. Is the wrong way of describing it. Yeah. But particularly some of the stuff that Brian Holm said, like him being like a fat Christmas turkey, and and I do touch it. Look, everything I wrote in that book, I always try to caveat with some degree, with humanity and sympathy. So whenever there was a passage like that or a quote like that, I always tried to put it kind of in between parentheses, like there would be, okay, someone else quoted shortly thereafter, sort of saying, yeah, but this was a response to stress. We try and understand where it was coming from, what his issues were. I was conscious that it could come across as gratuitous and mocking, and obviously I didn't really want that. And look, it's also interesting, it's interesting to investigate and interrogate where it actually did come from and where these issues do come from for a lot of people.
How important was it that he didn't agree to be a part of the book, or how hard did you even try, or was it actually easier to write without him being part of it?
It was probably easy to write without him being part of it. So tried at various stages. Certainly tried kind of immediately early on. And then, it sort of became clear 2016, 17, 18, he wasn't really doing any interviews. Not really. There might have been the odd one or two things. And in that period, I didn't really try. But I sort of knew that I needed to try again before the book was finished, whenever that was going to be. I was aware of when I've had the experience with Merckx as well. When you write a biography of someone, it's like, what do you do with an interview? What do you do? Say you get what ordinarily would be a decent length interview. They say, okay, you can come and interview me for 3 hours. And then what do you ask them? Because you're covering their whole life. Do you ask them about specific incidents? Do you, is it for like a final sort of set piece where you're just describing what it's like to meet them, what they feel like? Are you using the interview almost as a fact-checking exercise to put to, things? Because in a biography, I mean, there are thousands and thousands of factoids, and I have no doubt there are factoids. There are a lot of apocryphal stories that I do biographies. There are so many. I mean, and sometimes you put them in while knowing yourself that they've been embellished and exaggerated. And sometimes, very often, you find this out just when you check them, because someone will tell you about a race and they'll tell you, he won the first intermediate sprint, the second intermediate sprint, then he won the King of Mountains points, and then he won by 4 minutes. And then you go check, and the race doesn't even exist. They're describing something that it wasn't even on the UCI calendar. So that's another thing you could, in theory, do. That was a bit of a dilemma. It was a sort of a dilemma I was going to have with Merckx as well. But then with Merckx, he didn't want to do an interview, so I kind of ambushed him at an event where he was just interviewing he was doing interviews with a lot of journalists, and he didn't really care who they were. So, and I didn't really go to any lengths to explain who I was when I met him, and that served a specific purpose of, okay, I'm going to describe what this was like meeting him, a few quotes from him, and that's the last thing in the book. And eventually, that's kind of what I decided a meeting with Ullrich would probably be. I also was conscious that with the greatest interviews were not very insightful throughout the course of his career. And I was he's one of those guys you could be very sure how he was going to respond to everything you were going to ask him. And the book, the story, what is the story of someone's life? I mean, is it what's reflected out, or is it what's reflected back? The story of Jan Ullrich's life, or one conception of the story of Jan Ullrich's life, is also, it's all the people his life touched or came into contact with, and his impact on the world, his influence on the world. And is a story of, dozens, hundreds of characters. And there was more than enough. There was more than enough material by picking the best and the most significant of those stories. I mean, it's also, it's a biography of Jan Ullrich, but it's also, it's the story of an era in cycling. It's a story, to an extent, it was a story of I wanted it to be a little bit about Germany, to be honest. Germany, East Germany. So it was a story, a story about the drugs in sport, the history of drugs in sport to a certain extent as well. So it was a bit of a kind of, it was a bit of a prison to tell a few different stories.
Well, in the absence of Jan Ullrich himself, the kind of star witness almost became Lance Armstrong.
Now, this is the big team coming forward. These are the boys of Lance Armstrong. This is Rubiera right now with Armstrong in second position. They are accelerating. This is why they brought the climbers onto the US Postal Service team. They knew that Armstrong was strong in the mountains and put two big climbers alongside him. I don't believe I'm seeing this. Armstrong has been at the back for the whole day, and Ullrich is in difficulty now.
Well, I don't think Ullrich believes it either. Armstrong has given everybody, and maybe that was the plan, to give everybody the impression he was in trouble. And now Rubiera, who's looked after him all day, has put him at the front of Alduez. A good reply there by Ullrich, and this is going to be a mano a mano now, and it's all happening before the climb has really started.
This is where you have to race alone, and Armstrong's gone.
A big move by Lance this, and no reply coming at all from Jan Ullrich. Ullrich has got no answer to this acceleration by Lance Armstrong. So Armstrong has been holding everything under those legs till the last climb, and now he has launched the attack. He wants to win it out Alduez. We knew that. We were just not too sure he had it in him. He will thank Rubiera, who has completely sacrificed himself. He took a look straight into the eyes there of Jan Ullrich and said, well, here I go, are you coming or not? And the answer is not.
This is what Armstrong was waiting for today.
And the chapter with him is, again, it's very compelling. I still find Armstrong kind of fascinating. I know most people are sick of him.
The publisher didn't like that chapter. They wanted me to lose it completely, and I never really. I think it was the first thing I wrote, because I didn't write this in a very chronological way. It was the first thing I wrote, and I've had to fight quite hard to keep that chapter in.
It's mad. He's the most important character in the story, isn't he? Apart from Ullrich.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And there was so many. There was the day I spent with him was just so. From his point of view, it's probably completely banal. We had a decent time. We'd spent a good few hours together on a golf course. But from my point of view as a journalist, it was just so rich. Every gesture, everything he said, and I'm probably drawn to him purely as an observer, purely as a kind of caricaturist, you could say, for the same reasons that you are. I just find him, I know that some people can't, but I'm able to sort of displace any kind of moral judgment of him and whatever. That certainly was, in my case, is subordinated to my just fascination with the kind of richness of his character.
And what do you think now about their relationship with each other that has been blossoming over the past year or two?
There are people who are inherently suspicious of anything that Armstrong does. I think it's genuine. Is it slightly baffling? I don't think they're up late at night having really deep and meaningful conversations. I don't, although they spend a reasonable amount of time together now and have done over the last couple of years. The other question, is this a way for Armstrong to cleanse his guilt? Well, on two levels. Guilt on a smaller level vis-a-vis Ullrich, possible, and just, well, we've seen what he's doing now with Bradley Wiggins, that he's kind of playing the same Good Samaritan role. Is this a way that he sort of, for him to kind of cleanse his guilt about things that he did and ways he behaved earlier in his life and in his career? Possible. I think he'd probably just tell you that helping people in need kind of makes him feel good, and he's not unusual in that. there might be some distasteful aspects of his personality, but I'm willing to entertain the idea that he, like a lot of people, gets a bit of a kick out of helping others, particularly others who are in some sort of distress, and look, he has the means to help people in lots of different ways, like on a purely practical level. He's got a lot of money, he's got a lot of friends. It sounds like one of his threats now. He's got a lot of money, he's got a lot of friends, and he's going to destroy you. No, he's going to help you.
Do you think we'll ever see Jan Ullrich at the Tour de France again?
Yeah, probably next year. I mean, it's definitely moving in that direction. In what capacity? Until I kind of feel that ASO's kind of sheepishness about that era, is kind of layers of it are sort of falling away every year. I'm trying to think what the most recent example of this was. There was something I saw recently which kind of gave me pause. Maybe not to do with Armstrong, but someone else who had been disgraced and has now been sort of silently, kind of tacitly reintegrated into the fold. Which, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, that this is happening. And the only thing that will stop it happening is if someone writes an article about it or a piece about it, or a rider mentions it on the eve of the Tour de France, and then all of a sudden it'll become, the big news story. Or how come, so-and-so is suddenly on the stage before, stage one of the Tour de France, and then there'll be some, there'll be a kind of 2 days of hand-wringing, and there'll be some resolution that it has to stop, or that actually now it's okay. And but they just, they're able to do it because everyone's kind of moved on, and no one cares quite so much anymore. But it's still absurd. It's still absurd that we've got a situation. We've got a roll of Armstrong. I think, now if you look around at the Tour de France, their sort of furniture, their information boards, sometimes now he's not even crossed off as an asterisk. It's an asterisk. Whereas the no asterisk, there's no asterisk next to Bjarne Riis's name. Even the Bjarne Riis, when he confessed, he disappeared from the Roll of Honor for a year. Not sanctioned by the UCI, not sort of rubber stamped by the UCI, but ASO took him off for a year, and then they brought him back on just because they kind of could, and no one really said too much. It's absurd.
And will you ever write another cycling book again?
Well, I'm sort of writing one at the moment. But I'm sort of ghosting books.
Okay.
But no, I mean, look, if I had a different relationship with writing, then I would. I mean, there are plenty of books out there to write. Still, plenty of good stories, but I think you have to enjoy writing a bit more than that.
I'd say Lance Armstrong might be looking for a ghostwriter sometime soon.
You think?
Yeah.
Another.
Nobody's written a Tonkoff book yet.
Wow, that's true. That's true. But
anyway, thank you very much for joining me, Daniel Friebe.
No worries.
Great to have you.
Thanks, Cillian.
That's it for this episode. A big thanks to Daniel Friebe for taking the time to speak to me. I will continue to hassle him to let me onto the cycling podcast. In the meantime, he will be on that each and every week. I can't really imagine anyone who listened to this won't already be a listener to that. If you're not, what are you doing? Jan Ullrich, The Best There Never Was, is published by Macmillan Press and is available in all the usual places. But I would urge you to try not to line the pockets of billionaires and instead try and buy it from a local bookshop. And just a note to say I am aware this book was released nearly 2 years ago at this stage, and so a podcast about it now might seem odd. The reality is, it doesn't matter. This Cycling Books podcast isn't going to let a pesky thing like time get in the way of a good story. I hope you'll join me again soon for another episode of Cycling Books.